Coming up, a look at Braille education around the world.
This is Double Tap, celebrating Braille at 200. Now, here's your hosts, Stephen Scott and Sean Priest.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Double Tap. I am Stephen Scott. Today, we are continuing our celebration of Braille at 200 and also continuing our conversation on education. Now, yesterday, we were joined by Kate Crowan. She talked to us all about educating children in the US, also adults in the US. But today, we're going to focus again on children, but around the world. We're going to learn about the UK, Canada, and also the provision of Braille education in countries around the world outside of the West, the traditional countries we may talk about here at Double Tap. Well, we are going to get into all of that with our special guest today. Just a reminder, though, if you want to get involved and join in the discussion on Braille, here's how to do it.
Get in touch with Double Tap. Email feedback at doubletaponair.com. Leave us a voicemail at 1-877-803-4567. And now you can send an audio or video message to us on WhatsApp. That number is 1-613-481-0144.
And so to education, and a subject which is very close to my heart and something which I've been talking about here on the show many, many times. But there are nuances in this conversation, and that is why talking to our guest today is so vital. So let's continue our celebration of Braille at 200 with an interesting conversation around the education of blind children around the world.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth McCann. I am a qualified teacher of visual impairment, and I work at the University of Edinburgh, where I'm a teaching fellow in visual impairment. And I also work at the Scottish Sensory Centre, which is part of the university, where I deliver professional learning to teachers and to other people as well, who are all involved in the education of children and young people with visual impairment.
And that is exactly why, Elizabeth, I wanted to talk to you today, because you are the person I think who can help me understand the challenge that we face, I think, and it's fair to say a challenge, in the teaching Braille to children. The challenge being, of course, declining numbers of teachers with visual impairments being able to teach, and also for some, I believe, less of a desire to teach Braille, because, you know, a lot of children now are needing access to computers. So honestly, we could start in so many different places, but maybe we begin with a little bit of a background to you and maybe tell us a little bit about your history and your work in this field, not just in the UK, but internationally.
Well, I've been in the field for quite some time, and I started off many years ago on a secondment, actually. So this was meant to be a 23-month job. I was a primary school teacher. This secondment was advertised. I worked at the time with Fife Council. Come and join the VI service, it said. And I thought, there's a great idea. I had some pupils in my class with additional support needs. I was getting a little bit frustrated. Things weren't moving and being done for them in the way that I thought they should be. And I thought, great, let's go and do that for 23 months, come back. And then really my plan was promotion. That's what I wanted to do. So I joined the visual impairment service. And then 20 plus years later, I'm still working in the field. And I've been very fortunate. I've worked in a number of local authorities in Scotland. I was deputy head teacher at the Royal Blind School in Edinburgh on both of their campuses for around 3 years. I went to Canada, was a qualified teacher of visual impairment there. So yes, done a few things, and then most recently I took us again on a secondment to the University of Edinburgh to teach on the postgraduate diploma, and 8 years later I'm still here, and I'm now a permanent member of staff. So yes, a long history in visual impairment education.
Yeah, enjoying it, I guess, immensely by the sounds of it, and no desire to leave now and go anywhere else, right?
Not out.
Oh, okay.
Well,
never say never.
Never say never. Never say never. But I love aspects of my job. I love trying to improve the profession that I have been in for so many years, and that's what I'm all about now. It's you were saying at the beginning, less teachers interested in teaching Braille. I don't think so. I think actually there's been a resurgence. Has it been down to me? Well, I maybe have played a small part. It's down to lots of things. But very much when teachers are coming on the postgraduate diploma, which is mandatory qualification that they need to have, I spend a day teaching them how to teach Braille. And that I love that day. And that day sparks a lot of interest in the teachers because some have got no experience. They don't have a young person in their authority who uses Braille or perhaps even needs Braille, but their interest is sparked. And for some who are working with perhaps a more experienced colleague, they are really interested to know more. So undoubtedly, I think there is very much, I hope I'm sparking the interest. And certainly from the informal inquiries that I have at the Scottish Sensory Centre, I think there are more and more teachers who are ready to take on learners and to teach Braille. So that is a good thing. So I'm not quite convinced that teachers don't want to teach Braille.
Okay, that's interesting because I feel, today a lot of myths are going to get busted, which is a good thing. And that's exactly why I wanted to talk to you because, look, I'm sitting here saying these things based on information I'm getting, a lot of it anecdotal, because this is another issue, is data. There's a significant lack of data, I think, certainly up-to-date data on the amount of people out there who are actually using Braille. The numbers suggest that it's low. Do you think it's a higher number than, say, 10 or 12%, as we've heard from National Federation of the Blind in recent years?
It probably isn't. And I think you have to be very much aware of the number of children in Scotland, let's start off there, who've got a visual impairment. And again, our numbers are not accurate for that either. So, and that's a whole other discussion. We could talk about that for hours. So, but what we do know from the VINCIP database, that over half of the children who are registered with VINCIP, which is the Managed Clinical Network, over half of them have a brain-based visual impairment. And there are many children who've got visual impairment with other additional needs. So we take all of those factors into consideration. Yes, the numbers for Braille are quite small. That may be for a variety of reasons. We have to look at our learners in the whole. So we can't just separate out the visual impairment. We've got to look at their other needs as well. Do I think that perhaps more children would benefit from learning Braille? Perhaps so. And it's certainly something that I do impress a lot to my students because I say to them, we sometimes think about learners who may have more autistic-like tendencies, may not have a diagnosis of autism. But these young people, these learners are ideally suited to Braille because Braille is a rules-based learning system or a code. So if this happens, do this, or if Y happens, do this. And they take very well to that type of learning. Braille needs to be taught in a very structured manner. And again, that is ideal to often the way that they like to learn. So yes, perhaps it could be a little bit higher, but there are pros and cons and we have to think about those things as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So you really are looking at each individual child.
Absolutely.
And their needs. Because, look, I have this blanket view, and I've put it out there for years, and I say it really to provoke a discussion. If nothing else, I'm not going to change the world myself, that is for sure. But I do think it's important to have a discussion on this. And one of the things I talk about comes from my own personal experience, which I've talked about many times on the show, growing up with a visual impairment, being told by doctor after doctor after doctor, consultant after consultant, that my vision would never change. And then it did. Mm-hmm. And as a result of that, I now have less vision, certainly far less usable vision than I ever have had. And I can see the value of Braille potentially in my life. Now, that comes from having a TVI, a qualified teacher of visual impairment in our visual impairment unit at my school, in my secondary education, who was learning to teach Braille. And she used me as a guinea pig to teach me grade 1. And that was brilliant. Uh-huh. Now, at the time, I thought, never use this, right? I don't need it.
Yes.
But years later, when I needed it and I actually sat down to do my first Braille class, it literally came right back to me. I was like feeling the dots going, I know what this is. Mm-hmm. And it made me realize very quickly the value of having that education early in life, because if I had that, even if it's not used, even if it lies dormant, it's still there because our brains as kids just soak everything up, right? So it made me think, would it be a good idea to, instead of just considering, and of course you're giving a lot more nuance to this, but to consider not just blind children be a candidate for Braille education, but low vision children as well. Speaking generally, what's your view on that?
So, I mean, yes, I agree with you up to a point. And I can think of a learner that I worked with not that long ago, where I was in a clinic with that child and parent, and the parent was explaining that at the end of the day, the child went home and they lay down on the sofa and they went to sleep. And, you're sitting in the clinic setting and you're thinking, that's not right. A young person of 8, 9 years old shouldn't be going from school and be wiped out. But if the reason for that was because they were having to work so hard during the school day, then absolutely these are all the red flags that say to me, this learner needs another form of access. And that other form of access is Braille. So that then they have a choice, because as school moves on from primary into secondary, the volume of work only increases. And so absolutely. But so I did, I grasped the metal, being me, and started to, have that difficult conversation, because it is a difficult conversation. First of all, to have with the parents who, may never have thought, the word Braille may never have entered their head, or the idea that their child may need to learn Braille never crossed their mind in a million years. The child had vision, child could see, okay, reduced vision. And so you have to start having these tricky conversations. And that often can go one of two ways. They're either going to say flat out, not on your life. Who do you think you are? And so you have to be really careful about not, breaking that relationship that you have with the parents, over the sake of Braille, because, you potentially, and, some teachers work in, single authority at schools, they're just the only teacher of VI. You can't, it's hard to break that relationship when there's no one else. Or they go, well, we haven't really thought about that. Let us consider it. And if you've got that open mind to consider it, then, and they come back and say, no, well, that's okay. But you've opened that door to the conversation. And then you see how things develop. Now, actually, for that young person, the parents came back and said, hey, let's give it a go. We hear what you're saying. Let's do it. Let's see what happens. And so, we began that process. But again, it's looking at that learner in the whole. There were red flags there that said, things may not be working out for him as well as what we might think when we just look on a very superficial level. But for some young people, they're resistant. So, if that learner is resistant, that's not going to work for you either. If the parents are resistant, that's not going to work for you. And indeed, if the school, I hesitate to use the word resistant, but if the school need to be on board with it as well, because the thing is that learning Braille, it's not just about learning, first of all, the alphabet. You've got all your pre-Braille skills to learn, first of all. So it takes a bit of time. And then what does that learner miss in order to do the pre-Braille skills and then ultimately to start learning Braille? And the curriculum at the moment is jam-packed. And so there has to be that understanding that in order to learn Braille, you're going to have to miss something. And unfortunately, if you want to learn Braille effectively and efficiently, you need to miss a bit of something every single day, because that's the way you're going to learn. It's not just 10 minutes on a Monday and then you don't pick it up until the following Wednesday. It's got to be daily. And so there has to be half an hour at least of time each day set aside. So what do you miss out?
I guess many advocates would say, those who especially stand up and shout that Braille is literacy, would say, and I agree with this to a point, I think you said to me in a prior call when we talked, you said the phrase Braille is access to literacy, which I think is a much better way of putting it, actually. It's a much more appropriate and accurate way of looking at it. But, no other child would leave school without the ability to read and write. So it would seem to me an appropriate use of time, that nothing about learning Braille, as far as I'm concerned, would be a waste of time, or indeed be inappropriate to miss something else as a result of. I don't know if it, but I guess you have the challenge here, as you're saying, you've got the challenge with parents in particular. Now, is that because they are not prepared to see their child as blind? They see their child as low vision, perhaps, but they don't see their child as blind. So there's a whole psychology of this as well that you're having to deal with. It's more than just a condition.
Absolutely. I think that is very, very true in terms of, they've been to the hospital, they've listened to the doctors, and, the doctors play a huge part, and I'm not knocking them, but, they often go to the doctors and what the doctor says is the word, it is that's the gospel truth. And then the teachers come along, no, your child's not going to lose their vision. And I think as well, in the wider population, there's still this belief that Braille is only for people who don't see. Probably for those who see absolutely nothing. And we know, you and I both know that the number of people who see absolutely nothing is very, very small.
It's like 4% or something according to statistics, right? It's a tiny number of a tiny number.
So Braille, to a degree, needs better PR. Employ Saatchi and Saatchi, get the PR people onto it, because unless we can get over that hurdle of Braille's not just for people who are blind, it's a method of access. And I think very much in the UK, I think I'm correct in saying, because I've worked in Canada as well, we have very few people who would be termed in North America as dual media users. So they do print and Braille. So for some things they would use Braille, and at other times they would use print. We tend to, in the UK, fall into, or certainly in Scotland, I should say, you're either a Braille user or you're a print user, and never the twain shall meet. And that's perhaps a false way of looking at things. I think, moving forward, it would be a lot more effective and efficient for learners to have that option to use either media, depending on what they are doing, so that they are then able to pick and choose what suits the subject that they are doing. And I think that really is needs to be explored in much greater depth than it currently is.
What was your experience of dealing with parents in Canada versus in Scotland, for example? I mean, was there a difference in attitude when you talked about it? Was it partly because of this dual media approach, as you say, that perhaps parents were more or less resistant to Braille?
I think about one girl that I was working with who was a dual media user. And actually, she wasn't the greatest example because like many children, and certainly this has been my experience of working with dual media users, they tend to favour one over the other. And I can certainly think many years ago where I was working with someone actually at the Royal Blind School, I will mention no names, and this young person had access to Braille and also print, and had a deteriorating eye condition. And she would come to me. We would do a Braille assessment once a year, looking at, speed of reading and so on. And literally she would get her Braille note taker device. She would pull it from under her bed and would bring it into the room, and you would literally have to blow the layer of dust from the top because she had vision. And, I hear a lot from people, oh, well, it's because they don't have a role model of someone that's, using Braille. I was in the Royal Blind School. There were lots of Braille users there at that time. And they were still, they were clinging to print, in denial of, I'm a print user, I don't need Braille, I've been taught Braille, this is the way it's going to be. So I think when people say, well, they don't really have a role model, that's not always purely the answer or purely the reason behind it. But again, if we start learners younger, it becomes a natural thing. You've got print, you've got Braille. When you start introducing Braille later, it can sometimes be seen as a bit of a chore. So again, it's that starting off early, and I think that is really crucial.
Well, that was my experience. I mean, look, I learned grade 1 only because of that TVI, who kindly spent her time with me for her benefit as much as mine. I didn't realize how much benefit that was going to have until much later in my life. And, I really did find the benefit later, but being able just to put my fingers back on the page and immediately recognize the dots. And the learning process was much quicker as a result. It's interesting to me, though, you talk about your experience in Canada versus, well, not so much versus the UK, but also working in the UK and Scotland. And I'm intrigued by the approach. I remember being in Montreal for a conference back in 2008, a vision conference that they had held at the time there. And I remember meeting a group of kids from a school, I think it was in Montreal, and their approach surprised me, because their approach was to have children who had low vision wear eye masks and essentially live life with no vision during a portion of their day. Essentially get used to the idea of not using remaining vision. And this kind of ties into what we're talking about here, right? Because when I was growing up, it was the exact opposite. Everyone around me, from social work to education, it was, use your remaining vision as much as you can. And I did. And I think, looking back, and I can only say it from now, it was to my detriment, because I wasn't investing. I don't think I was investing enough in my education in the right ways to really allow myself to go further, to go forward further. I watched friends of mine who were being taught Braille and who were living with Braille every day go on to become lawyers and go on to do really high-powered jobs. And I didn't want to become a lawyer. I was never going to be that guy, right? But, that option didn't feel like it was open to me from an education point of view. I say it openly now, I winged it a lot of the time because reading visually was such a challenge for me. And it was because the door to Braille was closed. I was told, look, yes, this option was open to me for that few months. That was nice. But that was just for fun. That was just for pastime on lunch hour, not as part of a class. So this was just something nice to do. If I had had the option to learn Braille at that time, I don't know where my career would have gone. I'm not saying it would have been better than it is now. I love my career. I love what I do. But would it have been different? Would I have had more doors open to me? I don't know.
Yeah, and I find that really, really sad in terms of, having to learn it over a lunchtime. It's almost like punishment. And certainly, even now, we do encourage learners to use the vision that they've got, obviously, because, if you don't use it, you lose it almost. But again, it's looking at each young person as an individual. And, how hard, this is one of the things that one of my mantras that I say, how hard are we making our young people work in order to access print. That's one of the things. And it's not necessarily about acuities, because we have this discussion quite regularly within the university. What acuity, what level of vision does that child need to have in order to be able, or in order to be classed as someone who needs to learn Braille? And that's a false measure, because everybody is different. You can have somebody who reads N36 size print and reads it fluently and so on. And I've had people, maybe less experienced teachers, say to me, oh, they don't need to learn Braille. But I mean, they're not doing anything tactually. They're not, they're using their eyes. Well, that's because you're not giving them anything tactile. So, that's a false, argument as well. But that need to look at the individual, to look and see how they are, accessing the curriculum, not necessarily at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday. How are they accessing it at 9 a.m. on a Monday or 2:30 on a Friday? You have to look at things in the round. And there was a long time ago, I'm talking early 2000s, where the idea was, you only needed to learn grade 1 Braille. You need to know that contracted stuff. Far too difficult. What a load of rubbish that is. I very much am a great believer in contracted Braille. I teach it right from the beginning. Never really teach a learner the alphabet and then go back and teach the word signs. I mix it all in together. And I think it's such an important role. This is an absolutely essential skill for a QTVI. It makes us different from being a general support for learning teacher. And in this, age that we're in of extreme cutbacks and no money, being a teacher, a qualified teacher of visual impairment who knows contracted Braille, who can teach contracted Braille, this is what makes us unique. And we should have enthusiasm. You go in to teach a learner Braille, you have to tune into them. What makes them tick? What makes them excited? And use that to get them excited about Braille. And when you can do that, and they start to, learn the first few letters, you're on the path to learning and to literacy and to access to literacy, and not just reading. It goes much, much further than that.
Where is the challenge for you? Because what I hear from you is that, right now in Scotland where you are, there is a desire to pinpoint and really scrutinise children who need Braille and say, right, okay, this child needs to learn Braille. Let's make sure this child learns and focus the resources where they need to be. Is that because that's the right approach, or because you're struggling with the number of QTVIs, the qualified teachers of visual impairment, who actually know Braille to achieve that for a wider set of children potentially? Essentially, I'm asking, are children losing out because of the things you say, the cutbacks, the challenges that education departments face today?
I would say in terms of teachers coming through the course in Edinburgh, and we are the only provider in Scotland, the numbers have been fairly steady. I think perhaps the challenge is that it is an ageing profession. So, most of the teachers, I'm sure if you did a poll, certainly when I first came into the profession well over 20 years ago now, the average age of people were, and they were in their 50s. And when people retire, there's not that, and this has always been the case. This is nothing new given the financial climate that we're in, but there's rarely ever a handover between people leaving and new people coming in. So we then have a situation where we don't have there's not always that opportunity for mentorship. So these people that have worked in the profession for a number of years, not always having that option and or chance to pass on those skills and knowledge that they have. So that certainly is an issue that we have. So fortunately, Scottish Sensory Centre does exist, and we try to support as much as we can local authorities, whether that's through training for teachers and professional learning. We go out, we've certainly have done direct and targeted support in local authorities, and I also do consultancy with local authorities as well, mostly around the teaching of Braille and also some technology as well, because these are the skills. Unfortunately, as part of the qualification, as much as I would love to, I don't have the time through that mandatory qualification to go into great depths of how to teach Braille. If I could change one thing in the world, that's probably the one thing that I would do. As part of the mandatory qualification, you have to come and do, a 20 credit course on teaching Braille. And unfortunately, for some people, that would be absolutely ideal. They get a lot out of it. In some of the smaller authorities, they may not ever have a teacher, may not ever have a young person that will be a Braille user. But actually, would it be a bad thing to learn? No, it probably wouldn't. Because once you learn how to teach Braille, you've got those skills forever.
Exactly. Now, when I was going to school, and it feels a long time ago now, in comparison to today, I mean, we're talking 30 odd years ago, maybe more than that now, I dread to think about it. But when I was going to school, we were just at that time, it was the early 90s, and there was a push in Scotland, and I think more broadly across the UK as well, to get more children like me away from specialist education and into mainstream education, and to sort of break down the wall between the two. And that is where I think big change happened. We saw it firsthand ourselves at school, where we were always struggling to keep up with the mainstream kids, and we did our best, and the visual impairment unit that I was part of did everything it could to make sure that we were as equipped as everyone else. But it was challenging, and we didn't have the amount of technology and the type of technology that we have today. So, we had laptops, but they were inaccessible. We had, everything was printed out on large paper, and that was the best you could do. It was a real challenge. And I often think, what would my life have been like had I gone to a specialist school as opposed to being part of this mainstream education? And I can only go with the stories I hear from people who did go to specialist education decades earlier, who felt, and in their words, were never blind, were certainly not disabled in those environments because they had access to everything they needed. And they were pitched against each other to succeed. And so if someone wasn't reading Braille very well or very quickly, others would be, teasing them and saying, come on, you got to do this better. They were encouraged. Whereas I heard an anecdote from a friend who had visited a school, and he was shocked to see that a young girl, 9 years of age, was being praised for being unable to read a Braille sentence within about a minute. And he didn't say anything to the girl, obviously, but he did say to the teachers, this isn't good enough. This girl should be reading much faster for her age at this stage. And they were quite dismissive of that and saying, well, that's not, this is where she is. And so there felt to him, from his experience of being pushed and encouraged, to a much more lax approach to saying, well, they're trying hard. What's your take on that? Where do you stand on this as looking at it from your perspective? Is it a good thing that we've integrated in this way?
Yes, I do. I do see, inclusion as a good thing. I only see it as a good thing, though, if you are supported appropriately. And there's the thing. And I've certainly, in all of my career, I've always advocated that, if you're a Braille user, then you have a visit from a qualified teacher of visual impairment 5 days a week, because Braille is literacy. It's access to, a wide range of literacy. But, especially if you're still at that learning stage, and you say, well, teacher goes in 4 days a week. And I say, what happens on the fifth day? Do you not do literacy on the fifth day? I mean, because every other child does. So what does the child who's blind do? So yes, that is the thing. And to be a little bit controversial, I think one of the huge problems in education in Scotland is in sensory services. Visual impairment's always been ever so slightly the poorer relation to deaf education. And, we have sensory services. But actually now, more and more, we're moving away from sensory services and we're moving to even bigger additional support for learning services. And so we are having fewer services who are line managed by teachers who are qualified in visual impairment. Now, I've gone through a huge amount of my career where I've been line managed by a teacher of the deaf. But sometimes when I've been in bigger services, we've had a sort of a depute who's qualified in visual impairment. And, those services, and I can, name a few local authorities, those still do exist in a few places. But generally speaking, a teacher of visual impairment often has no line manager, or a line manager has no qualifications in any form of sensory impairment. Now, this is a big thing, because I remember as a young teacher, and even as someone who is more experienced, you are peripatetic, you're going out, you're seeing a variety of young people in a variety of settings of different ages. And you come into the office once a week and meet up with your colleagues, and you need to have that debriefing session of going in to see someone else who's qualified and saying, oh, I went out to see so-and-so this week and they were doing this and I'm just not sure, I've got this idea. Do you think would this work? Or maybe I should be doing something else. You need to have it, and that's what's missing. So you need that more experienced colleague that you can have these conversations with. And that is sadly what is missing. Where we've got people who really know the job and can take, those concerns and say to that teacher, yeah, you could try that. Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And throw out some other possibilities. And I see that as one of the main areas where, things have changed. It's interesting that you say about, young people that have been in specialist settings. I can always remember quite vividly when I worked at the Royal Blind School, there was a young man who had left school and gone to college, and he came back for a visit, and he said, oh, he'd loved his time at the school. And he said, oh, I'm enjoying college, but, sometimes I don't get my work on time. And actually, I think, when you're here, he talked, meaning the school, everything's just there. It's all just there. It's all just handed to you. You never need to think about that. But actually, what he was saying was he hadn't been taught the self-advocacy skills. So everything was just presented to him on a plate. And so it was a really interesting take from him, that he didn't have the skills to say, excuse me, I need this. And so are we teaching, so what I'm really saying is there are pros and cons. Yes, you can, you've got that peer group, but actually, the other thing that I do remember as well, I remember lots of positive things, but I'm going to give you another sort of slightly negative one, is I worked with a group of very able, academically able young people who were in sixth year, and they were talking about what they wanted to do for the future. And they were residential within the school. And they were talking about going to college and university and saying, I just want to stay at home. I want to go to university, but I want to go close to home so I can stay at home. And I kind of felt, you've got things backwards. because they had been residential as teenagers and actually probably from primary school as well, or at least from 10, 11, 12, they were going to university. This is a time that you should have been wanting to stay away from home, to stretch your wings and to be part of that wider university and college life. And actually they wanted to stay at home. And I thought, there's something just not quite right about that. That they felt that they'd missed out on that home experience when it was right and proper that they should have, had that nurturing home experience. They wanted to have it in their university lives. And, that just didn't seem...
institutionalized approach almost that comes into this, isn't it? And I think that's something that we perhaps don't consider, or I hope we consider more today. And it sounds like from what you're saying that you do, is that you're considering the health, the mental health of the child, as well as everything else. Because I think for a long time that was not the case. We didn't even think about that. And you could argue we never really considered mental health more broadly until maybe 10, 20 years ago properly. It was always something that was in the back of our minds we would consider but never say out loud. We didn't know how to. And I think that for a lot of blind children who, are institutionalized in that way, you do, that has an impact. That has an impact on everything going forward. It has an impact, as you say, on the social aspects, the social impact of our lives that, goes beyond everything else. It's a very interesting area. Honestly, I could talk to you for hours on this. It's so interesting. But I want to ask you about your experience internationally more broadly, and in particular into other parts of the world that we perhaps don't consider as much, and we should. You were recently in Jakarta. Tell me about your experience there and what Braille and how Braille was being taught there.
Yeah, it was a wonderful experience. I was there as part of a grant from the British Council. Myself and my boss were helping a university in Jakarta to prepare to accept students with visual impairment. Now, for those people who are listening to us, they must be thinking, what is she talking about? So to make it clear, in Indonesia, if you have got a visual impairment and you decide to go to university, you can't just apply to go to any university of your choosing. The university has got to be registered with the Ministry of Education in Indonesia to accept students with visual impairment. So very, very different. So we were working with a small university called Universitas Al-Azhar who wanted to accept students with visual impairment. And myself and my boss were out there in Jakarta in May doing some training with university lecturers on how to make materials accessible, and staff from the university visited us here in Edinburgh and met our disability services and talked to actually a former student who had completed her MSc in inclusive education. Who's blind, came from China at the height of COVID, believe it or not, and completed her MSc. A very, very interesting young lady who came and with her laptop and her Braille display and did her learning that way. So when I was out in Jakarta in May, I met some students who were in different universities, those who had already been approved to accept students with visual impairment. And they came and talked to us about their experience of university in Jakarta. And I also met a lady who was blind who'd done her university education in Australia. And she said something to me that was very, very interesting, because students in the main in Jakarta are accessing learning materials on a laptop with a screen reader, mostly, I would say exclusively NVDA, because it's free. And she said to me, in Jakarta, we are producing learners who are illiterate. Our learners who are blind are illiterate because they rely totally on screen readers. They have no Braille displays. Braille displays are not used because, unfortunately, price. And And when I was speaking to the young people themselves, I was asking them about their education. So it's true to say that in Jakarta, the profile and the reason for visual impairment is very different from what it is here in the UK. So often they live in isolated places, they have preventable causes of visual impairment, and also through diabetes as well. We have a very sweet tooth in Jakarta, or in Indonesia, I should say, as a whole. When they often start off in life being fully sighted, attending mainstream school, and as soon as they lose their vision, they have to leave mainstream school and go to a special school. And when they're there, they start off by learning maybe a little bit of Braille, and then very quickly they move on to a keyboard with NVDA. And that is how they access their learning. It's all through listening and through speech. And we know here in the UK that learning by listening alone is not literacy. We would never dream of saying to a sighted child, that's it. Your books are being taken away. You can listen to your teacher read. It just wouldn't happen. And yet here we are in Jakarta, in Indonesia. This is how young people are learning. And as a result, their written communication is poor. They don't know how to spell words. I was actually speaking to a parent here quite recently whose daughter is also very much a fan of listening. But she came across the word czar, but didn't know how to spell it. Now, a word that comes up in modern studies and history, because it's a very unusual spelling. So again, it just highlights the fact that listening on its own is not good for spelling. It doesn't teach you anything about layout of books and pages and letters and all those sorts of things, which may seem quite trivial, but are hugely important in terms of communication with people that you don't know well, applying for jobs, and life beyond school. And everything, unfortunately, comes down to cost in Jakarta. We know here in the UK that note-taker devices are incredibly expensive. It's just, for us, it's expensive. In Jakarta, it's hugely prohibitive. And so they've taken the line that is the cheapest. They've got access to computers. They've got access to NVDA, and off they go.
And that's it.
Yeah.
What was your experience in Canada regarding access? Because again, we think, of countries like Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, as wealthy countries. Did they provide equipment well in Canada? And how did that compare to the UK?
Yes, so I worked in Toronto for Toronto District School Board, and Toronto is a huge metropolitan city. So we went, just having talked about Jakarta, we go from the sublime to the ridiculous. So I supported actually 3 Braille users on my caseload. Had a brother and sister who were in 2 separate schools, and I had a young Braille user who was just starting out to learn Braille. But if we think about the brother and sister, first of all, in their school, they had the full setup. So they had note takers, they had computer in their school that was dedicated for their use. They had a Braille embosser, they had a scanner, they had software that, so if, a teacher suddenly said, oh, I'm going to do this worksheet in this class, this period, you could take the worksheet, you could scan it, you could flip it into Duxbury, you could emboss it, you could do everything. And the young people themselves were taught how to operate Duxbury, to do a very quick, a scan and emboss a worksheet themselves if they so needed. So a completely different setup. Often here we've got one central location. Not every local authority has someone that is employed to do transcription. That's a huge issue. in Scotland, because of Curriculum for Excellence and teachers devising their own material, that's a huge issue because schools are using different things. So we don't have that ability to share. There was a bit more structure in our texts and in our approach to the curriculum, then that would obviously help those who are learning Braille. There could be much more sharing of materials or producing materials centrally. So yes, Canada, lots and lots of equipment. That even at one point when I was there, they were even talking about providing learners with phones that were accessible. So yeah, very, very, very different.
I wonder what you feel about the future of Braille as we sit here at this anniversary of 200 years of Braille. It's been here a long time. I certainly don't feel it's dying. I don't feel it's going away, but I do worry, and I've said this many times on my show, to much hate from many people for saying it, but I do fear the declining number of people learning it and the cost of accessing the equipment. What's your view on the future of Braille?
Well, I think Braille's going to be around for some time. I'm not retiring yet. And I do see within the QTVI population as a whole, certainly the ones that I am interacting with and my students and those that I see going out when I go out on placement in different places with students, Braille is definitely still very much alive. I think there's certainly a lot in terms of, there's been a lot of work done and a lot of push in terms of technology. And that's been a little bit of a concern. And it's great that iPads are all singing and all dancing, but they're not for everybody. And voiceover is great. There's been a huge explosion in that type of technology. But I think really interestingly, Braille is almost catching up. And if we think about in the recent, past few years, we've got more and more movements forward in terms of Braille technology. So with the arrival now of multi-line Braille displays, this is great. We've got superb work being done down at Bristol Braille and open source and things like that. We also think about just recently, and I know that you're going to be talking about this as well, the Page Connect. What an amazing device. I'm absolutely thrilled that has come to market. I think that is an absolute game changer because, for so often, some of the barriers in terms of children using a Perkins in a classroom was that the work couldn't be read unless you had someone who could read Braille. The Page Connect is a game changer in terms of being able to see exactly what that learner is producing. So I think there are so many exciting developments around technology and Braille, which is keeping Braille, very much, it's not replacing, it's not like a screen reading technology. I absolutely see Braille as something that's got longevity.
I think there's something you said at the very beginning, and to bring it back to that as we reach the end of our conversation here, is you talked about the need for better promotion of Braille. And I think you're absolutely right. I think it does need a better PR agency behind it. There was one comment that we got, which I thought was very interesting as an idea. Many children in schools around the world are often taught, either as part of a day or maybe a special event in school. Mainstream kids are often taught British Sign Language, American Sign Language, whatever it might be. Would it be an idea for mainstream children to learn a little bit about Braille as well and actually get hands-on with it too, to have a bit more of an understanding, almost let them be the advocates of tomorrow?
Yes, I think that would be a wonderful idea. I think, if we could embed it into the curriculum, what we don't want is it to be tokenistic. And so that's my only slight reservation. There are moves afoot, certainly. At the moment, you can get a qualification in BSL. And what we're hoping to do in Scotland is to put forward a proposal to SQA to have Braille recognised as a qualification. So in the first instance, I would hasten to say it would be for learners who are using Braille as their medium. But there's nothing to say that in the future, if there is capacity to do so, I'm not quite sure if we've got the capacity at the moment, we'd need to think about this really carefully, that this could be something that perhaps other learners could access as well. So I definitely think, and Lego produced Lego Braille bricks, a lot of debate as to whether that is actually Braille because it's not the size of Braille.
Yes.
Another huge conversation, let's not go into that. But again, it's a small...
But you're right. Yeah. That has been a cause of controversy. Yeah.
Indeed. But it's a small step to actually making people aware of Braille. And that we did some research at Scottish Sensory Centre led by Professor Ravenscroft. And that was one of the things that came out, is that it helped teachers in mainstream schools and sighted peers to understand what Braille was all about. And anything that can raise the awareness of Braille.
It gets people talking.
Absolutely. Anything that
gets people talking about it.
Awareness.
That's so important. Elizabeth, it's been an absolute joy to speak to you this hour. Thank you so much for giving us your time today.
You're welcome. It's been great to talk to you too. And let's have another conversation about Braille.
And a huge thanks to Elizabeth McCann for joining us today on the show. We move on to technology. You'll be pleased to hear on tomorrow's Double Tap as we dive into the latest innovations and really get a bit of a state of the nation about where we're at with Braille technology. We'll be joined by Stuart Lawler from Sight and Sound Technology. We'll also be joined by Gregory Hargraves. He's the guy behind a product called Page Braille, which is going to be available in more countries very soon. We're going to be talking to Gregory about his creation and how it's bringing the Perkins Brailler up to date in 2025. A very cool device. He's also got many thoughts on the provision of Braille and the teaching of Braille as well. We'll get into all of that on tomorrow's Double Tap as we continue to celebrate Braille at 200.